His name was Muhsin Hendricks. He was 57 years old. He called himself the world's first openly queer Imam. He had spent years arguing that Islam and queerness were not incompatible, that the interpretation of Scripture had been distorted by patriarchy, and that queer Muslims deserved a version of their faith that included them. He was in George, South Africa, officiating the marriages of two interfaith heterosexual couples. And then he was shot dead in what investigators described as an execution-style killing. Muhsin Hendricks walked into George, South Africa, carrying a title no one else dared claim. 57 years old, he had lived every day since 1996 as the world's first openly queer Imam. Not in secret, not in exile, but in the full glare of a society where the law and tradition both spelled danger for men like him. He had come to George for one reason: to officiate the marriages of two interfaith heterosexual couples, a task that should have been routine, even mundane, for any other cleric. But nothing about Hendricks's life was routine. Every ceremony, every public act, was a statement against the centuries-old consensus that said queerness and Islam could never share the same space, against the unbroken chain of jurists who had ruled again and again that men who loved men deserved nothing but punishment. He knew the risks. He had been dismissed from his mosque, shunned by colleagues, threatened by strangers. Yet, he kept moving forward, founding the Inner Circle and later the Al-Ghurba Foundation, building a space where queer Muslims could exist without apology. He did not hide, and he did not soften his message. He stood in front of cameras and crowds insisting that the Quran's message had been twisted by patriarchy, that the real sin was exclusion, not love. His presence at an interfaith wedding in a town like George was not just a pastoral duty. It was a direct challenge to the boundaries drawn by both mosque and state. Hendricks was not just officiating marriages. He was making a claim on the future of Islam, and everyone knew it, including those who wanted him silenced. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. 15th of February 2025, George, South Africa. Hendricks sat in the back seat of a white Toyota Corolla, minutes from officiating two interfaith marriages, contracts between men and women, not the unions his critics obsessed over. The street was quiet. Then a dark sedan pulled across the road, blocking any escape. Two masked figures stepped out. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They raised their guns and fired through the glass. Multiple rounds, close range, straight into the back seat. The shots echoed against the concrete. The official police statement called it execution style. Not a robbery gone wrong. Not a random act. Deliberate. Calculated. The killers vanished before anyone could react. Hendricks died instantly, surrounded by wedding documents, his phone still open to a list of vows. Forensics found no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. Just the cold geometry of a planned hit, vehicle blocked, victim trapped, bullets delivered with clinical precision. Police cordoned off the scene, marked the shell casings, and began the slow, methodical process of cataloging evidence. The word spread fast. South Africa had lost the world's first openly queer Imam, not to debate, not to exile, but to gunfire. The cost of pushing boundaries was now written in blood. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. Every debate over queer inclusion in Islam, every threat hurled at Muhsin Hendricks, traces back to the machinery of Islamic law. 14 centuries of juristic tradition have not left the question open. Classical fiqh divides sexual acts into categories with consequences: hudud for the fixed, God-ordained punishments, ta'zir for the judge's discretionary lash or fine, and sin for what is condemned but left to the afterlife. In the Hanafi manuals, male-male anal intercourse, called liwat, falls under hudud, demanding death, but only if 4 upright male witnesses testify to the act itself. The Maliki school, stricter in doctrine, sometimes allows ta'zir, sometimes insists on stoning. The Shafi'i and Hanbali jurists echo death by sword, by stoning, by whatever the ruler chooses, unless the impossible standard of proof fails, and then the judge may settle for imprisonment or public humiliation. These are not fringe opinions. They are the backbone of the legal tradition, repeated in every major commentary, invoked in fatwas from Cairo to Jakarta. Yet the evidentiary bar is set high, and in practice convictions are rare, but the shadow of the law remains. The message is clear. Same-sex acts are not private matters, not in the eyes of the law, not in the eyes of the mosque. To challenge this is to challenge the very lineage of authority that defines orthodoxy. That is the wall Hendricks ran headlong into, and that is the wall that still stands, reinforced by centuries of ink and blood. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. Viral video, stripped of context and yet impossible to ignore, captured a room full of ordinary Muslim men, teenagers, fathers, elders, each with a hand raised in answer to a question that cut through the noise of theology and debate. The speaker did not ask about obscure legal texts or the technicalities of proof. He asked who among them believed the punishments detailed in the Quran and Sunnah, death for sodomy, stoning for adultery, should be enforced today. Every hand went up. No one hesitated. No one looked away. This was not a gathering of radicals, not a fringe cult or an online echo chamber. The footage, time-stamped June 2022, came from a youth conference in Johannesburg, organized by the Muslim Youth Forum. The men identified themselves as mainstream, mosque-attending Sunnis, unaffiliated with any so-called extremist sect. The questions were simple and the answers unanimous. There was no debate, no dissent, no visible discomfort. The room itself became a kind of referendum, a public, collective endorsement of punishments that Western progressives dismiss as relics, yet here, in the hands of the faithful, remained alive and unyielding. This is the scale of the challenge Hendricks faced. Not just a wall of doctrine, but a living consensus embodied by the people themselves. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. The Inner Circle began as a lifeline for those no one else would touch. In 1996, after his public dismissal, Muhsin Hendricks built it from the ground up. A refuge for queer Muslims, a counseling network, a challenge to the iron logic of exclusion. He was not content to offer private comfort. He opened his doors, published his name, and dared the world to answer. By 2011, he had established Masjid ul Ghurbah, an inclusive mosque in Cape Town, where the call to prayer did not come with a threat. Here, same-sex couples found a place to wed, and interfaith pairs could sign their vows without fear. Over 1,200 people passed through these doors in less than a decade, each one a living rebuke to the claim that Islam belongs only to the straight, the male, the orthodox. Hendricks' theology was not a gentle plea for tolerance. He called out the patriarchal distortion of Scripture, naming it as violence, not tradition. He taught that the Quran's message, compassion, justice, the dignity of every soul, had been buried under centuries of male anxiety and legalism. His method was maqasid-based hermeneutics, start with the purpose of the law, not its letter. He asked, what is the real harm in love? Who benefits from exclusion? His sermons did not hedge. He told his listeners the sin is not in loving but in turning others away. Testimonies from those he counseled are blunt. One woman, exiled from her family, said Hendricks taught her to pray again. A man, shunned by his own mosque, found in Hendricks a path back to faith. Each story is a record of what was possible when tradition's gatekeepers lost their monopoly. These were not just isolated acts of kindness. They were a vision of a different Islam, one that the mainstream refused to recognize, but that, for a brief moment, existed in the flesh. Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. The investigation ground to a halt before it ever found traction. The Department of Justice issued a statement of shock, reaffirmed constitutional protections, and promised resources. Human Rights Watch called the killing a hate crime and demanded a full inquiry. But as the months passed, the case file gathered dust. By January 2026, not a single arrest. No named suspects, no official motive. The police insisted they were pursuing leads, but the facts spoke for themselves. The world's first openly queer imam was executed in broad daylight, and the machinery of justice stalled at the starting line. International NGOs filled the vacuum with statements and hashtags. Human Rights Watch and ILGA pressed for hate crime charges, citing Hendricks' history of threats and the public nature of his advocacy. The Hate Crimes Working Group pointed to a pattern: queer activists murdered, cases left unresolved, and the law silent. Yet the state's response never moved beyond condolence and procedural promises. On the other side of the world, Western activists marched under banners that read, "Queers for Palestine" and "Allah loves gays." Rainbow flags and keffiyehs tangled in the wind, slogans echoing through London, Berlin, and New York. The logic of solidarity demanded a coalition, oppressed with oppressed, minorities united against the majority. But inside Muslim communities, the message landed differently. Public statements from the Muslim Judicial Council and United Ulama Council condemned the violence, but made clear that doctrinal boundaries would not bend. On social media, Muslim commentators rejected the alliance outright. They called the Rainbow Palestine Coalition a Western fantasy, one that erased the legal and theological realities faced by queer people in Muslim-majority societies. So what does solidarity mean when the very coalition imagined on Western streets is denied by those it claims to represent? How does an alliance hold when its foundations, law, scripture, and lived experience are at war with each other? Subscribe for more stories that refuse to look away. A 57-year-old imam was shot dead in George, South Africa, while blessing two interfaith couples. It was an execution, not an accident. In rooms of raised hands and on protest banners, Western slogans demand solidarity. But what happens when legal fact collides with doctrine? The alliance is still a slogan, not a reality. Subscribe for more.